Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Mr. White here, minus my voice, as you can tell. So hopefully you can hear me. If not, just turn the volume up as much as you can on your device, whatever you're watching this on. And also get out that blue test review paper and follow along as we go over all the answers for your Unit 4 K-Level Economics Review. All right. First up, taxes. You know, they say there's only two things in life that are guaranteed: death and taxes. All right. Taxes obviously means money the government takes from businesses and individuals to support government programs. So this is revenue for the government. It's important that you know that there are different kinds of taxes. The first kind of tax you need to know is called a progressive tax. A progressive tax is the kind of tax that increases as your income increases. So the more money you make, the more money the government takes. A perfect example of this would be the U.S. income tax. Currently, right now in the United States, if you are a really wealthy person, let's say if you make over $250,000 a year, you pay almost 40% of your income in taxes. But if you're a really poor person, you might pay 0% or maybe only 10% in taxes. So in the United States, the more money you make, the greater percentage you owe in taxes, and that's called a progressive tax. Next up, the opposite of a progressive tax is a regressive tax. Regressive tax means the percentage of tax that you owe decreases as your income increases. So basically, the less money you make, the more money they take. A great example of this is the U.S. sales tax. The reason why is that even though poor people don't have the ability to buy as many things as rich people do, poor people spend a much greater percentage of their income on goods and services. Many poor people live what we call paycheck to paycheck. So that means that every time they get a paycheck, they spend 100% of it on goods and services. For that reason, more of their income is subject to sales tax than a wealthy person. Wealthy people get so much money that even though they buy a lot of stuff, they still have a lot of money left over. And so that means as a percentage of their income, much less of their income is hit by sales taxes. And for that reason, sales taxes are more adversely affecting poor people than wealthy people. Next up, a proportional or a flat tax. That means that everybody pays the same percentage of tax regardless of their income. A good example of this could be the estate tax. The estate tax is what you pay when you die and you pass on money or property to your heirs. The problem with that is that we don't want people just getting money for doing nothing, and so we tax that income. But regardless of how much income you pass on, as long as it's more than $10 million, it's subject to a 40% tax. It doesn't matter if you pass on 10 million or 1 billion, it's going to be taxed at 40%. And so that's what we mean as a flat tax or a proportional tax. Just keep in mind, the estate tax does not apply to regular people like me and you. As long as you're not passing on more than $10 million to your descendants, you don't even have to worry about this tax. So I guess in a way it only affects rich people, but it affects all rich people the same. Now, next up, Federal Insurance Contribution Act, or FICA. What that is that's money that gets taken out of your paycheck to fund Social Security and Medicare. Social Security and Medicare are programs that are designed to help people when they get older. And so while you're younger, you pay into these systems, and then when you're older, you get money out of the system. It's a kind of a transfer payment, but that's what FICA means. And next up is a sales tax, okay? We just talked about sales taxes. That's just a percentage of the price of a good or service that you have to pay in tax when you purchase the good or service. And last up is an excise tax. Excise tax is a tax on a good or a service that's usually deemed to be harmful to society. So when we see this, it's sometimes called a sin tax because the things that you buy that have an excise tax are usually considered sinful or bad, like cigarettes or alcohol or even gasoline, because of course gasoline's bad for the environment. So when the government charges these companies for producing these harmful products, generally the company will include that in the price of the product and pass it on to the consumer. This is a big reason why cigarettes and alcohol and gasoline are usually pretty expensive. It's not that it's so expensive to produce those things, but it's because there's a lot of tax included in the price. So that's an excise tax. All right, next up, what is money? It's the root of all evil, right? Some people love it, some people hate it, but everybody's got to have it, money. Now, remember that in the United States, the kind of money we use is called fiat money, basically paper money. The term fiat means by decree of the government. So the only reason why our paper money is valuable is because the government says so. You may also remember that I said it's our confidence in money that gives it value as well. So fiat money is intrinsically worthless. It's only worthful because we believe it's worthful and we will accept it for payment as goods and services. All right, the functions of money. What do we use money for? First function of money is that it functions as a medium of exchange. So in other words, you can buy and sell stuff with it. It must be acceptable, portable, divisible, and uniform. As long as it meets those criteria, that's the first box you have to check to be considered money. Next up, money functions as a unit of account. That means it helps us keep track of prices and the value of goods and services. It can even help us to compare goods and services to know if they're good or bad, or if one product or service is better than the other. So it's useful in quoting prices, and it's familiar. Everybody knows the value of the money. And then the last thing about money is that it needs to function as a store of value. A store of value simply means that you can use the money now or you can save it for later, but it's still going to be valuable. So for that reason, money needs to be durable, which means it needs to last a long time. And generally, we want our money to have a stable value. So that means we should not see a lot of inflation occurring with whatever kind of money we have. So all of those are the functions of money: medium of exchange, unit of account, and a store of value. All right, now when it comes to the federal budget, remember the federal budget is how much money the government spends and how much money the government brings in. So we can have different kinds of budgets based on how much the government spends and how much they bring in. Okay. Now, the first kind of budget is what's called a deficit budget. A deficit budget is where our expenditures are greater than our income. Next up is a surplus budget. A surplus budget is where the expenditures are less than the income. And then there's a balanced budget where our expenditures are equal to our income. In other words, we spend the same amount that we bring in. It's important to know that when it comes to fiscal policy, taxes are the source of income for the government, and government spending is what we would call expenditures for the government. So if you've ever heard about our national debt, the national debt is actually the sum of all previous years' budget deficits. Basically, if we take those years where we spent more than we made and we add up that amount over time, that tells us our overall debt, how much we owe to other countries. Now, next up is the money multiplier. The money multiplier is a mathematical equation that tells us that every dollar we spend in the economy actually creates greater than $1 of economic activity or productivity. So basically, when you spend money, it creates a ripple effect that touches all parts of the economy. So spending $1 will yield more than $1 of production for the economy. That's the money multiplier. Just make sure you know that. All right, now in K-level, we talked about aggregate supply and demand. Hopefully you remember that aggregate supply and demand is that sort of complicated model of supply and demand where we have two supply curves, one demand curve, and what it's trying to show us is the total level of productivity in the economy as well as the price level. So aggregate supply and demand shows the demand of all final goods and services that could be legally purchased in the U.S., kind of like our GDP. As a matter of fact, maybe you remember it's actually GDP that's measured across the x-axis of our aggregate model of supply and demand. The price level is measured on the y-axis. So if for some reason our GDP components increase, like if we have more consumer spending or more government spending or more business investment or more exports, that is going to be an increase of aggregate demand, and we would see our aggregate demand curve shift rightward. If we had a decrease to any of the components of our GDP, like a decrease to consumer spending or a decrease to government spending, that would cause a leftward shift in aggregate demand. Now, an increase in the price of resources would cause our short-run aggregate supply to shift leftward. That's a decrease of short-run aggregate supply. Whereas a decrease in the price of resources will cause our short-run aggregate supply to shift rightward, which is an increase of short-run aggregate supply. Remember that when these shifts occur, it's going to cause a change to price level and output in the economy. You need to practice shifting around your aggregate supply and demand model to observe how the price level and the level of real GDP or the level of output, which is the same as the level of real GDP, to observe how those things change if we had an increase in aggregate supply or aggregate demand or one or the other, okay? Now, generally, if we have more productivity, like more technology or workers working harder, it leads to a lower unit production cost. So in other words, each thing that we produce is cheaper. And so therefore we can provide more and our SRAS will increase. If we have less productivity, like for example, if our unit production cost is higher, our SRAS is going to decrease. It's going to shift to the left. Generally, if the SRAS ever moves to the right, the price level is going to drop. If the SRAS ever moves to the left, the price level is going to increase. The opposite is true for aggregate demand. If the aggregate demand ever moves to the right, the price level will increase. But if the aggregate demand ever moves to the left, the price level will decrease. Okay? Please study this model of aggregate supply and demand. There will be a few questions on the test about it. All right, fiscal policy. This is a big one. Hopefully you remember that fiscal policy is controlled by Congress and the president. So fiscal policy is all about taxes and government spending. Remember that taxes are just money that's paid by citizens and businesses to the government. So income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, estate tax, those are all examples of things the government can increase or decrease. If they increase taxes, it has an effect on the economy, just like if they decrease taxes. The same is true of government spending. The government spends money on all kinds of different programs like welfare, infrastructure, and the military. So if the government chooses to spend more on those things, it's going to have an impact on the economy, just like if the government chooses to spend less on those things. Now, when it comes to fiscal policy, we know that we have automatic fiscal policy, which just happens when there's a change in the economy. But we also have discretionary fiscal policy, where Congress and the president have to actually act and pass a law and make decisions. In our discretionary fiscal policy, we can either be expansionary or contractionary. Let's talk about expansionary. Expansionary fiscal policy happens when the economy enters a contraction phase or a recession of the business cycle. Congress needs to implement an expansionary policy to try to increase consumption. So this is very important, guys. Remember that the phase of the business cycle that we're in is always going to be opposite of the type of monetary or fiscal policy that we implement. So when we're in the contraction phase, we must use expansionary policies. Expansionary fiscal policy requires the government to decrease the taxes. When government decreases taxes, it allows consumers to spend more of their income, and so consumption will increase. They also would want to increase government spending. The reason why Congress would want to increase government spending is because when they spend more money on programs like food stamps, consumers like you and me don't have to spend as much of our money on food, and therefore we can spend more on other goods and services, so our consumption will increase. Not to mention the fact that government spending is a direct component of GDP. So if the government spends more, that's also going to help increase our GDP and move us out of a contraction of the business cycle. Hopefully you remember that the worst part of the contraction of the business cycle is unemployment. So also by decreasing taxes and increasing government spending, we can increase employment and help with our problem of unemployment. Okay, next up is contractionary fiscal policy. Remember that when the economy is in an expansion, everything is not great because a lot of the times we see inflation during the expansion. The government and the Fed don't like inflation, so to fight against inflation during the expansion phase, we will implement a contractionary fiscal policy to try to decrease consumption. Remember that demand is one of the main causes of inflation, that demand pull inflation. So we need to lower demand to keep inflation down. The way that the government does that is by increasing taxes. If we increase taxes, it's going to be harder for consumers to spend money because they're not going to have as much money in their paychecks to spend. And the government will also cut programs, like they'll cut back on their government spending. The reason why they'll cut back on government spending is because that will directly reduce GDP because the government spending will go down. But also consumers will have to spend more of their own money buying the basic stuff that government used to provide, like food stamps. So if the government were to cut food stamps, what that would do is make it harder for people to be able to buy extra stuff because now they're going to have to spend more of their money on food. Now, in addition to fiscal policy, which is conducted by the government, we also have the Federal Reserve. And remember, the Federal Reserve is like the banking system of the United States. It's the national bank of the U.S. So since the Federal Reserve is in charge of our money supply, that's why we call what the Federal Reserve does monetary policy. And when it comes to monetary policy, there are three different tools. The first tool is called open market operations. That involves the buying and selling of government bonds. Whenever the Fed wants to affect the economy, that is their go-to tool. That's the first tool they're going to use. It's the most important tool. When the Fed buys bonds, it puts more money into circulation. When the Fed sells bonds, it takes money out of circulation. And this has an effect on interest rates. The interest rate that's paid by banks when they borrow money from the Fed is called the discount rate. So if the Fed puts more money into circulation, the discount rate will fall. But if the Fed takes money out of circulation, the discount rate will rise. That has an effect on how much money the banks can borrow. And of course, it also has an effect on how much money you and I can borrow. And the last thing that the Fed can change, but they usually don't, is called the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is a rule that banks have to follow. It says that when you deposit money in your checking account, the bank can only loan out a fraction of your money. They can't loan out all of your money in your checking account. The fraction that they have to hold on to that they cannot loan is what's called the reserve requirement. Now, just like the government, when the economy is doing poorly, the Fed wants things to speed up. So generally, when we enter that contraction phase of the business cycle, the Fed is going to implement expansionary monetary policy. And the goal for the Fed is to increase the money supply. When there's more money out there, we assume, ceteris paribus, people will buy more, and that'll help the economy get back on track. So when we're in a contraction, the Fed will buy bonds, because when the Fed buys bonds, it makes the money supply bigger. So remember, buy equals big. That's what we need to do in a contraction. When the Fed buys those bonds, it's going to cause the discount rate to fall. The reason why the discount rate goes down when the Fed buys bonds is because now all the banks are going to have a lot more money. When all the banks have a lot of money to lend, they have to compete with each other to get people to come into their bank and get a loan. Of course, we know banks like to give loans because that's how banks make money. So generally, interest rates will go down if all the banks are competing with each other to try to extend loans. Now, if there's a really severe economic downturn, the Fed might also change the reserve requirement. Basically, the Fed would decrease that requirement so that the banks are free to loan out more of the money they have. If they can loan out more money, that means more money for house loans, more money for car loans, more money for business loans, and essentially it's going to help the economy grow just because there's going to be more money out there available. Now, contractionary monetary policy is the exact opposite. When we're in the expansion phase of the business cycle, remember the big concern is inflation. So the Fed wants to slow down the growth of the economy to keep inflation under control. And so that's why they implement a contractionary policy during the expansion phase, because it's going to decrease the money supply and it's going to slow down the rate of inflation. So when it comes to open market operations, the Fed is going to sell bonds. Remember that sell equals a small money supply. So if the Fed wants the money supply to be smaller, they sell bonds to banks and take away the bank's cash. When the banks don't have very much cash to loan out, there's less competition for them to give out loans because barely any banks have money to lend. So the few banks that do have money to lend can ask for a higher interest rate from their customers. And that tends to discourage borrowing, and it also discourages consumption, which keeps inflation lower. Last of all, they could change the reserve requirement. If the Fed wants to slow down the economy, they're going to increase the reserve requirement, which will force banks to hold on to more of their deposits, and therefore it reduces how much money they can loan out and put into circulation. All right, last thing is the short answer prompt. Please, guys, take your time and come up with a good answer to the short answer prompt. What I want you to do is pretend like you're the chairman of the Federal Reserve, right? Pretend like you're Janet Yellen. Let's pretend that right now the current inflation rate is 1.1%, not very high inflation, but the unemployment rate is 8.7%. It's pretty high. And real GDP has declined by 3% during the last 2 quarters of the business cycle. So think about what that means. Then go ahead and answer these questions. First of all, what phase of the business cycle are we in, and how do you know? I'm not just looking for contraction or expansion. I want to hear how you know it's a contraction or an expansion. The other thing I want to know is, based on what phase of the business cycle we're in, is consumer spending too high or too low? Explain how you know that. Next up, What kind of monetary policy action should you enact as the Fed chair? I don't want to hear expansionary or contractionary. I want to hear specifically, what are you going to do with the reserve requirement? What are you going to do with the discount rate? And what are you going to do with your open market operations? Don't just say expansionary or contractionary. That's not enough. Okay. Also, the Fed chair is frequently asked to speak in front of Congress. If you were asked to testify before Congress, what kind of fiscal policy actions would you urge them to take in order to help the economy? Once again, guys, I am not looking for you to say expansionary or contractionary. I want to hear specifically, what should Congress do with taxes, and specifically, what should Congress do with their spending? Don't just say expansionary, contractionary. Tell me what they need to do. And last of all, if Congress did take your advice, would their actions be classified as discretionary or automatic fiscal policy? You need to think about what it means to be discretionary fiscal policy or automatic fiscal policy, and then explain to me why their action would be that one. Okay? So if you take your time and sit down and write this out, I would be happy to look it over and tell you if you're on the right track before the test. But if you just come in here and see what happens, no guarantees, guys. So please do the smart thing. Prepare yourself for this test and come in here and get a great grade. Of course, if you have any questions, just come ask me. Otherwise, good luck on your test, guys.